Just start. So what we were going to consider this afternoon was, first of all, some of the things that go wrong in relation to dairy production. We've talked a little bit about some of these already. I want to give a little bit more detail, but basically what we've been outlining so far has been, what goes right, or how these very intensive production systems operate. So I want now to focus on what goes wrong. Metabolic diseases, the cow with that big energy deficit, very prone to metabolic diseases. And we've talked about hypocalcemia, but one we haven't talked about is hypomagnesemia, grass staggers. Do you get that in India much? Do anyone know? Hypomagnesemia?
Not more issue.
Okay. It's called staggers because the cows, their gait goes. Magnesium is an element which is used in muscle contractions, and so they get very wobbly and they fall over. And it happens when they're out at pasture usually, and it's all to do with the mineral balance. So I'll talk a little bit about those four main minerals are responsible for all the problems: magnesium, calcium, sodium, and potassium. Yeah, those four minerals. Fatty liver disease and acidosis. So we'll talk a little bit about acidosis, what the problems are. In fact, we'll do that first. So, metabolic acidosis is when you get very acid conditions in the rumen. The acid is absorbed and the blood becomes acidified. And this is essentially a problem of eating too much rapidly fermented starch and sugar, particularly with cereal grains. When the grains are smashed up by machinery before they're fed to the cows, then it exposes all the starch, and that starch is then very rapidly digested by the bacteria in the rumen. So that's a bad thing, and the correct processing of the grains is really important. So if you take a little cereal grain, it should be cracked, but it should not be split open. If you feed it whole, then it's likely to go straight through the cow undigested. The same with maize, with wheat, with barley. You have to process it somehow, and you really just want to crack it open, but not smash it open. So the metabolic acidosis is a problem with too much concentrates in the diet, not enough fibre. This is NDF is neutral detergent fibre, which is physically active. One of the signs you get is a very low milk fat percentage. In the old days, they used to talk about a low milk fat syndrome. And that would be quite often when cows go out and have very young pasture. There's not enough fibre in it. In fact, putting cows on young pasture, that's just the same as feeding them too much concentrates. The pH in the rumen goes down to perhaps about 5, thereabouts, and it's also fluctuating quite rapidly. Because young pasture has a very low fibre content, and often it's very lush and wet as well, and that makes it difficult to digest for the cows. You can quickly tell if they have these problems because they get diarrhea, and that diarrhea is responsible not just for it's indicating that the cow has digestive problems, but it also causes problems in itself, in that the back end of the animal gets all dirty, the tail gets all dirty, and so in some parts of the world they actually cut the tail off. In Australia, actually. It used to be in Canada. In Victoria, not in Queensland, I should say. So in the south of Australia, they have a habit, and it's very contentious. People want it banned. They cut the tail off because the bottom part of the tail gets dirty with feces. Canada, I think it's banned now. New Zealand, I think it's banned. And also, just diversifying a little bit in sheep, if they have the same problem, and to some extent in cattle, when they have very dirty bottoms, then all the flies come in and start attacking the back end of the animal. And that's really nasty. So sheep get fly struck, and part of it is the staining of the wool at the back with urine and feces, which attracts all the flies. The flies are programmed, they've shown it experimentally, the flies are programmed to smell the urine. They can detect the urine from quite a long way away. And so they home in on the animal in its back quarters. Anyway, more about sheep later. It's a problem with uneven feeding as well. Sometimes farmers like to feed, especially if they're in rangeland conditions, they might only feed their animals twice a week, once or twice a week, even not in rangeland conditions sometimes. And so the animals will eat too much too suddenly, and it's much better to feed them a little bit every day. They can get lethargic. They can also get bloated. Now, there are two sorts of bloat. One is a frothy bloat where the foam is all stable in the rumen. And then you get a pasture bloat, which is from legumes usually. And under those conditions, the foam is relatively stable, and the only way to stop the animal dying is to go into the rumen with a sharp pointed spear, a trocar as it's called, and that will release the gas. How can we treat it? Well, one way to help the cows is to alkalinize the feed, and we can use treatment of straws with sodium bicarbonate, also with ammonia. Sometimes people put straw into a vat, and then they use cow urine or sometimes human urine, and that liberates ammonia. When you seal it up, it liberates the ammonia. That will help to treat the straw. Do you have that in India? Yes. Straw treatment? Yeah. Urea treatment. Urea treatment. Ammonia treatment works much better than urea treatment. Urea treatment is really just mixing urea with straw. It doesn't chemically treat the straw, but ammonia treatment will break some of the hemicellulose lignin bonds. Yeah, and it makes it more digestible. As far as I know, urea treatment does not increase the digestibility of the straw.
But on that, some research.
Yeah, it could increase the digestibility of the straw because you're putting nitrogen into the system. So you're feeding the bugs.
Is silage the same thing like this?
Silage is grass that has been put in, the air has been excluded from the grass, and so the grass ferments. Yeah, so you have to seal it, and then the grass literally becomes alcoholic. It ferments. And then eventually the bacteria get killed off because there's no more sugars available. So it's just like brewing beer or making wine, making silage. It's a bacterial fermentation. Okay, the best way to cure acidosis is to feed the cow long fibre. And we can tell how well she's functioning by the amount of time that she spends chewing. And what the chewing does, of course, it produces saliva. The saliva is very alkaline. It's got potassium carbonate in it. And then that goes into the rumen and neutralizes all the acid. So the pH in the rumen, the acidity in the rumen is really important. It's very responsible to the chewing behavior and the number of meals. It is possible to feed specific buffers. You can feed sodium bicarbonate to the animals, and that will help them. Okay. Vast amounts of saliva produced every day, and it depends a bit on the type of feed. So dry feeds stimulate more saliva production than wet feed. So that's the same with humans. If you eat a very dry cracker, you chew it a lot longer and you produce more saliva than if you eat, I don't know, a beef burger or something. Well, you wouldn't eat a beef burger, but sorry, that's a very bad. If you eat what's something that's wet? Chicken curry, yes, yes. Whereas if you eat those dry crackers, you salivate a lot. Because one of the purposes of saliva, well, two main purposes. One is to make the food suitable for swallowing. So the saliva makes it moist. Otherwise, your throat would get damaged by, hard particles. So it makes it moist and soft for swallowing. And of course, the other thing with saliva is it starts the starch digestion process. It has amylases in it, so it starts the digestive process. So what do we do to reduce acidosis? Lots of small meals. Feeding cows 5 or 6 times a day is really good. Or mix the concentrate ingredients, mix the cereals with the grasses, and then the cows can't pick out the high quality bits, which are digested very quickly. Make sure there's long fibre in the diet. Now, what is long fibre? Well, it's all determined by the hole leading out of the rumen. And that hole, I forget the diameter, I think it's about 6 centimeters. Either 4 or 6 centimeters, I can't remember which. Anyway, you need the fibre at least 12 centimeters to make sure it doesn't all shoot through the hole undigested. And you need slow-release starch, such as sodium hydroxide treated grain, or slow-release sugars, such as beets, Beta vulgaris. I don't know if you would grow that here. Beets. No. Your sugar comes from sugar cane, I'm sure.
Yeah, but recently, I was recently at NDR, and there was a company, they started making beet sugar.
Really?
And they were there to, say that if this fiber, the residue can be used as cattle feed.
Yeah.
There's some research going on.
Very good cattle feed, the sugar beet pulp. Standard in the ration in those intensive dairies I was telling you about. But it has sugars in it, it's got fibre in it, it's a very good product. Okay. And we saw a couple of days ago pigs chewing the bars of their pens on a regular basis. We saw a little video of that. Calves do just the same thing. They will chew the bars of their pens repeatedly. Why do they do it? Well, again, they're producing saliva, which is alkaline, to neutralize the acidity in the stomach. And they do it especially when they're in a small pen, isolated, like we have here. Not very nice for the calves. These are very social animals. They have no mother. They have no access to other calves. They're pretty unhappy. And so they start producing a lot of acid in their stomach. And remember, these are not ruminant animals at this age. So they haven't got a rumen, which is, moderated for pH. They have a true stomach. And the pH will be down around 3. So they're at risk of acid conditions. And so they start producing a lot of saliva through this licking. They will lick each other. They'll lick the buckets. We can probably see it here. They will lick each other's ears. They'll lick their preputial sheath. They'll lick their mouths, calf kissing behavior. It's because they're programmed to suck. You know, they're programmed to suckle from their mother, and they can't do it. Normally these calves at this age, they would be suckling 5 or 6 times a day from their mother. We stop them doing it. One of the worst things is if we feed them from a bucket, which is where they have to put their heads down into the bucket, because they're programmed to suckle with their head facing upwards. And that means that the milk bypasses their rudimentary rumen directly into the abomasum, which is their true stomach. They have the rudiments of a rumen, they have the basics of a rumen. And if the milk goes in there, then it can start fermenting, and then they start scouring. They can get pretty sick because you can get bad bacteria in there. And so this is why calves should not really be feeding head down in a bucket. They should be feeding from a teat which is attached to a bar up here. And that will lead to a storage vessel for milk. Now, you'll probably say, okay, but the milk will go off, but you can stop that by acidifying the milk, and that will keep the calves healthier.
Then, like I understand, it's you know, this position, this height of feeding may not be appropriate for calves who are still on milk. But what happens when they come when they come on solid feed?
Yeah.
So at that time, is it okay to feed them from the ground?
Absolutely, because the rumen has started working, and so the feed then will all go into the rumen, whatever height their head is at.
And
So it's fine.
How common would be these stereotypical behaviors in say a herd of 100 cattle raised in the same manner? How often one can see that?
Pretty common. I mean, you could see it in, you know, probably in a situation like this. You might well see it in a couple of cows. Sorry, 2 out of every 10 calves. But the behavior is actually helping the calf because it's neutralizing the acidity. That's the problem. They've all got the problem. They've all got the same problem. Some of them have worked out how to stop the problem. And that is the issue. And people say, well, maybe if we're breeding, we could not breed from the cows that have got the stereotype behaviors. That's the wrong thing, because the stereotype behaviors are actually helping. That's the same with all of the problems. Some of the research which has been done show that the stress levels are actually higher in the calves, showing these stereotype behaviors. So these are probably the ones that have got more of a problem. And so they work out how to do it.
So when they say they will do selective breeding for animals who don't show such behavior, it's because it's not good to the human eye, and it's not because it's good for that.
They don't like to see it, but in reality, you know, really you've got to change the system. Have the calves drinking from teats. At very least, what you can do is put a little teat into the milk so that it floats, so that they can suck the milk. Because that's the other problem. Once they've learnt to drink milk, I don't know if some of you will have had it. Sorry?
I was telling that they give the cow milk in the bucket.
Yeah.
In the bowl.
Yes. Yeah. You will have taught calves how to drink milk. Have you?
No. You are giving milk direct to the cow, mother.
Right,
But
yes.
Some
Yeah.
other people say if the calf died, the mother will not give the milk.
No. Okay.
They put the milk in the bowl and give it to them.
Yeah, okay, yes. I don't know. Sounds strange. But when you're teaching a calf to drink milk, it's quite a tedious process. It's a long process, but basically you have to put your hand in the milk, get it covered.
Hand in the milk and with the finger.
Yes, encouraging the calf to drink from your hand. And it can be very frustrating because some calves will not learn how to do it.
It's not a natural system.
No, but that's it. It's not natural. So you can keep trying. No, the calf won't
And it's
drink.
not good for the calf.
And it's not good for the person either.
As well as the mother.
Yes. No, that's right. It's not a natural system at all. Very unnatural. But it's easy. It's easy to manage. That's why we do it. So, these stereotyped oral behaviors, excuse me, are they related to the nutrition? Well, when we started feeding extra sodium to calves a few years ago now, we noticed that the calves spent much less time engaged in stereotyped behaviors, grooming themselves, licking their pens, licking the buckets, mouthing their pens, ear sucking, etc. So another reason that they do this, these stereotype behaviors is to stimulate sodium production through the salivation process.
So is that the reason we see salt licks?
Yes, salt lick. Yes, it's this is essentially saying that the calves are short of salt. So if we give them a salt supplement, they don't perform these bad behaviors.
Is it possible for cows to develop stereotypical behaviors later in the life if they didn't have it as calves?
It's unusual. Most of the stereotypic behaviors, they start as calves. So it's a problem with their management as calves. That's when the problems start.
It also reduces the economic value of the animal.
Yeah, I don't know. I mean, in the horse it does, definitely. If the horse is cribbing, then you have to declare that when you sell it, and it'll be devalued by 10, 20%. I'm not sure. It depends in different places, I guess.
Yeah, I heard a farmer saying that this particular cow has this problem. I think
Right.
it was a cross-sucking.
Yeah.
She was doing cross-sucking, and
Yeah.
that's why it was like there is a problem in selling her.
She's learnt that as a calf, not as a cow. Yeah, the problem starts when they're very young because they're programmed to suck. You know, when a calf comes out of its mother, what does it do? It gets on its feet. It's actually programmed to start sucking at any right angle, like that. So actually the calf starts directing its sucking attempts to the front of the cow as much as the back of the cow, because she's programmed, it's in her brain to start sucking at the cleft of a right angle. And so eventually she finds the udder and starts sucking. And that's why some cows, you know, give a lot of problems. If the udder is big and pendulous and the calf is looking up the top of the cleft, doesn't find it, it needs to, you know, it can't find the udder. That's a problem. So cows that have a really big udder, which is almost on the floor, they get culled. And that's one of the problems why, you know, in Western production systems, you don't usually milk the cows as well as allowing the calves to suckle, because the calves will make the udder very, very pendulous, very long, and the calf can't find the udder. The milking machine won't attach to the udder because the milking machine has a claw piece like this at underneath the 4 teacups. So you've got 4 teacups like that. They all connect into a claw piece which holds them down, and then if the udder is too low, that sits on the floor and it doesn't hold them down properly. So again, the cow has to go. So conformation of the udder is really important. And some farmers will select their cows based on conformation of the udder, whether the udder is a nice shape. And it should be tight and held up to the body. There are ligaments all around the udder, like a bunch of grapes, that hold it together. And there's a ligament coming from the pelvis as well, down the middle. If they get damaged, then the udder goes like that. The cow cannot survive. Okay, so that's a little bit about sodium. Just a few more words about sodium. if you look at the relationship between sodium and potassium in grasses, it's an inverse relationship. So if a grass has a high sodium content, it has a low potassium content. Now I mention this because grass is very responsive to sodium. Sodium is used as a fertilizer. I'd imagine it is here as well. Definitely nitrogen, but also sodium, nitrogen, potassium, phosphorus are the three main fertilizers. If we increase the potassium content of the grass by fertilizer, we reduce the sodium content. And that's not good for the cattle, because they want sodium, they don't want potassium. But the grass wants potassium, so there's a bit of a fight. And what's happened with intensification of dairy cow production systems, that farmers are using a lot of potassium fertilizer to make the grass grow fast, but it's not good for the cow. The cow wants sodium.
And what happens in organic production systems when you don't really fortify grass with anything?
You'll have a nice high sodium content and a low potassium content.
Which is fine for the animals.
Yeah, but the grass doesn't grow as fast. You know, potassium fertilizer can push the grass to grow very fast. Yeah. And if we look at the distribution, if we look at the sodium content of grass, what we need is, we need at least 0.15% here. We need at least this. And we find quite a lot of grasses have actually got less than the amount of sodium which is required by the animal. A lot has more, but a lot has less. And potassium, again, we can see there's a big range in the concentration. This is the potassium to nitrogen to sodium ratio. So we want at least 0.15% in the diet. And this shows that in an Italian ryegrass, if we have a high potassium content, we have a low sodium content. If we have a lower potassium, then we have a high sodium. So this is the critical potassium. So this is how much potassium the grass needs to grow properly. 3.5 or 2.5%. Now, what is important here is that the plant doesn't need only potassium. Some sodium can substitute for potassium. So some farmers now, they use sodium as a fertilizer, which is good for the cows, and it can be used for some of the plant's requirements as well. So it's a win-win situation. Okay, we won't. And various some grasses respond more than others. These on the right-hand side here are the grasses which it would not be possible to use salt as a fertilizer. These grasses on the left-hand side, they respond quite well. Perennial ryegrass, cocksfoot, barley, oats, and some of the clovers. White clover good, red clover bad. I'm not sure about berseem clover. Maize is bad, lucerne is bad. So not all plants will respond. Okay, this shows that as you apply potassium to the pasture, so here we are applying 125 kilos a hectare, 250, 500, the sodium content goes right down below that critical 0.15%, which is what the animals need. Now, if we do use sodium as a fertilizer for the land, we find that the grass grows faster, can grow faster, has a higher water-soluble carbohydrate content, its digestibility is higher. This is the dry matter digestibility. And of course it has a higher sodium content and a lower potassium content, but also a higher calcium content. Now potassium is an element which stops, both in the rumen and in grasses, it stops magnesium and calcium being absorbed. which is really important because we've said that hypermagnesemia, hypercalcemia are two big problems for cows, milk fever and staggers, two big metabolic problems, particularly on high-yielding units. And we can, if we use sodium as a fertilizer, we can actually increase the calcium content because we're reducing potassium. So potassium is doing all the wrong things. And using potassium as a fertilizer, it was found about 30 years ago that this was one of the main reasons for grass staggers, for that hypermagnesemia occurring in cows, because people had started using a lot of potassium fertilizer.
Are there any ingredients that can neutralize its impact?
The potassium? No, not really. It's some fairly fundamental chemistry in the plant and in the rumen as well. So the potassium content in the grass is also very important because that stops magnesium being absorbed in the rumen, and that's what causes the staggers. And also calcium absorption as well. So potassium is, yes, it helps the grass to grow well, but it's not good for the animal. That's the problem. So we can get benefits. And if we use sodium as a fertilizer rather than potassium, we can actually make the cows graze for longer. They like the grass so much because it's got that sodium that they want. They start producing more milk, has a higher fat content. They lose less weight or they gain weight. They graze for longer, and they graze faster. So it's all good from the animal's point of view. So I think one of the messages is, you know, a farmer is not just fertilizing his land for the crop's benefit. He should be aware of what the animal needs as well. Okay, I don't think we'll go into that. That's complex. Yeah. The rumen pH now. So as we use sodium fertilizers, the availability of calcium goes up. As we said, potassium goes down, sodium goes up, of course, and the magnesium in the diet goes up. But the calcium availability has increased quite a bit, so we've actually doubled calcium uptake altogether by replacing a potassium fertilizer with a sodium fertilizer. End of milk fever, no more milk fever. So by correctly balancing the minerals, we can overcome a lot of these metabolic disorders. So just to summarize on the sodium effects, sodium in this case increased the grass quality, increased the digestibility, improved the mineral uptake, which resulted in production benefits for the cows. Okay, so we're just coming to the end of what I wanted to say about cow production. We've looked at dairy breeds, their susceptibility to metabolic diseases and how they've been bred for very high yields, how dairy cows increase their milk yield in the early lactation by losing a lot of body fat, looking at the time of year cows calve. It determines how they're fed. And we've looked at how, as a cow ages, its yield and its body weight increase, but it becomes more susceptible to metabolic diseases, and we've focused a bit. Now, the average cow lasts 3 to 4 lactations, and in high production systems, 2 to 3 lactations. Okay, that's all I wanted to say on cow production and performance. Does anyone have any questions at this stage?
I have one.
Sorry? Yeah. Yep, go for it.
So when we talk about feed and the mineral content in the feed, how much impact does the water intake has along with the solid feed that we provide to cows? Because it also has its own constituents.
Yes. The cow gets its water content from two sources, of course. From imbibing water, from drinking water, but also from water in the feed. So it depends what the animal's being fed as to how important a separate source of water is. Now, sheep and goats, which I'll talk about in a minute, they can get away without any source of separate supply of water. But cows nearly always need a separate supply of water, and they need it usually not just twice a day for 10 minutes. You know, because some farmers will only give them drinking water when they're coming in to be milked, if they are being taken to be milked. They should really have it 24 hours a day. In terms of the water content of the diet, it is very important. Very wet feeds, like we mentioned azolla earlier, is a very wet. I don't know if you process it before feeding.
No, we mix it in the grass.
Right.
Processed.
Not processed.
Just taken out and mixed.
Yeah. So it's very wet. It's only maybe 10 or 12% dry matter. Yeah. Is it
8%.
8% dry matter? Wow, very low. It's nearly all water. Yeah. Well, cows have real problems with a feed that is so wet, unless it's mixed in with another feed. So that's fine. But if you were to feed azolla by itself, they could not eat it very well. It would have too much water in it, and it would need to be dried.
Like, I have seen it all the time especially in peri-urban dairies.
Yeah.
They mix all the feed and water. So they would take some dry fodder and they will feed some dry fodder, the chopped dry fodder in the beginning.
Yeah.
But after that, because there are no greens, because it's very expensive to source greens,
Yeah.
they would mix up fruit peels,
Yeah.
fruit pulp,
Yeah.
bread,
Mm.
and water, and some oil cakes, which will be mixed in that water, and then that will be fed.
Do they have a separate source of water?
For cattle,
Yeah.
no, they don't
No.
need any water afterwards. It's only the
Right.
one that they get with the feed.
I think that's a welfare problem. I think they should have a separate source of water, because it means if the water is just what's in their feed, the cow cannot take more water if it wants it. The water requirements of a moderate yielding dairy cow are pretty huge. We've looked at that already, and a high yielding cow will need over 100 litres a day. A low yielding cow perhaps a little bit less. Generally 5 litres of water for every litre of milk being produced. So legally in Australia you have to have a separate source of water for animals. It can't just be in the mix, because some farmers, they like to feed pigs just with a wet mash, and legally they have to have a separate source of water. In fact, our university farm was doing that incorrectly. So the water is very important.
And somewhere in the presentation we learned about how fat in the milk is influenced by the feed that is being provided to the animal. But I see in buffaloes, especially because their milk is high in fat, I'm not sure if there is any impact on the fat content based on the feed that they're given. Because they're given pretty bad feed, but still the fat content in the milk is very high.
Mm. I think it would be the same process, because the biology is just the same as the cow. The fat comes from the digestion of fibre, and some of it comes from the animal's body itself. More of the unsaturated fats in the milk come from the body's what we call de novo construction of fat. The body is liberating fats to put directly into the milk. So 2 sources of the fat in the milk, from the fibre and from the animal's body itself. That's going to be the same in buffaloes. But yes, they naturally have a fat percentage which is about 5.5%, so
And that's
it's high.
Despite of the bad feed, there is still high fat content in the milk.
Yeah.
That does mean.
That's right. Of course, the milk yields of buffalo are usually less than cows, I think. So it may be that the fat, the actual fat yield is just the same for the two. It's possible. Yeah.
Just one last question.
Mm.
We have observed that, especially at the large commercial dairies here, farmers put their cattle on their cows on high concentrated feed just before the cowing. Why do they do that, and what are the welfare issues in that?
Yeah, I mean, that's steaming the cow up. I just go back to this slide here. Okay, if we just... You can split the... okay, you can split the dry period in two. So you see that here, the dry period is split into two. This first period, the cow would have just ordinary, just grass, no concentrate feed. And then the cow will start to be given concentrate feed here. It's really to prepare the rumen for these massive intakes, which she needs to get ready to take. You know, you'll see here, so food intake doubles.
Also to reduce the acidosis problem, because
Right.
cow take time to propagate or to multiply its lactic acid bacteria.
Yeah, yeah.
But isn't it more like a challenge feeding for the cow, because
Yeah.
she
Feeding
is,
terms is in pig.
no, but in cows also, because you're actually, giving them
Yeah.
steroids.
Yep.
It's like giving them steroids and then weaning them off again from that particular feed. What do you
Yeah, yeah. I mean, I know what you mean. Challenge feeding in the West, we call it lead feeding, I think. So you're leading them onto high milk yields. It's exactly the same concept. By making them put on body fat here, you're leading them towards high yields. And is it bad for the cow? I think it depends on whether the genetics. And whether the lactation diet is adequate for the cow. It's not good for the cow to go in really low level of condition and to be susceptible to those metabolic disorders. We know that then she's got welfare problems. And you can go on to a farm. I told you about the farm I went to visit in Estonia, which they were very proud of, and I thought probably a third of the cows had no flesh on them at all. It's hard to imagine exactly what a cow is thinking, what's going through her mind, but she can't be happy with no energy. She appears worn out, like a human female who's 40 and has had 25 children or something. Then she's worn out by that time, and that's no good. Welfare not good.
With standard acceptable practices in the industry at the moment.
Yes, unfortunately. Yeah, and it's getting worse. I mean, that has got a lot worse in the last 30 years. Since I first started working with cows, which is a long time ago, as Dr. Prasenjit said, nearly 4 decades, a long time ago. Yeah, the whole thing has got much worse. That cows are now expected to produce 7,000 or 8,000 litres. The milk yield has doubled in the last 50 years, from about 4,000 litres per cow. This is in Western countries. 4,000 litres per cow, on average, to 8,000 litres per cow. So it's doubled. Just the same way that a meat chicken over the last 50 years grows twice as fast. It'll put on a kilo. It grows to 2 kilos in 6 weeks. 50 years ago, it took 12 weeks. So, we're doubling production every 50 years, but the animal can't cope with it. In chickens, we have a lot of metabolic problems as well, lameness problems especially, and a lot of problems. In the cow, most of it's metabolic disorders and lameness again. So the animals are telling us that they can't cope. We're not doing much about it, but that's your job, Khushbu, and my job to tell people that the animal can't cope.
Yeah, and that's what works when we talk to the industry. We have to go and give them research and give them evidence of what we are saying.
Yeah. They have to see the facts, which is partly why I've taken quite a scientific approach on this course, because I think you have to have the facts.
Unfortunately, we don't have many research in Indian context.
No. Yeah, I mean, a lot of industries in a lot of countries in the world will say, but that wasn't done in Australia, that wasn't done in Mexico. It doesn't matter. It's, a cow is a cow is a cow. She still responds the same way, but I know they will still say, but it wasn't done in India. I mean, you're fortunate in India that there has been a lot of dairy research done, and India has had some very good research done and published in its own journals over the last 50 or so years.
Or just production?
It's production oriented, but I mean, it may give you statistics on metabolic disorders, things like that. Yeah. So there has been something done, Any other questions? Okay, we won't be long on sheep. I'm not going to talk about goat nutrition at all because we touched on that yesterday. How are your levels of interest for sheep compared with cattle? I don't hear an amazing clamour for sheep, but anyway, we'll talk a little bit about sheep. That has actually been probably more work done of the fundamental nutrition, and I'm not going to talk to you about fundamental nutrition, but more work done with sheep than with cattle, for the simple reason that in these research institutes, which PhD students spend a long time in, sheep are much cheaper to run experiments with than cattle, and much easier to handle, easier to measure. So there's been a lot of work done with sheep. Okay, so just a few basic husbandry principles for the sheep. Good nutrition and water are very important for the good health and vigor of sheep. I mentioned yesterday, I think it was, sheep are cheap, like goats, and so they tend to get neglected quite often. Obviously they're used for meat or wool production, and of course over the last 50 years or 60 years now, wool price has been gradually going down. It's gone up a bit lately, but generally the value of sheep for producing wool has been declining for 50 years. It's not like that with our other livestock industries. Pigs, of course, as you know, it goes up and down, the profitability cycle. Cattle is variable. It's very good at the moment. Cattle prices worldwide are very high. But sheep for wool, gradual decline for 50 years. And this means they tend to get neglected.
It's just sorry.
It's
just because of the demand for wool, or it's something more?
No, it's the demand for wool. It's synthetics, rayon.
Blend.
Who's wearing wool? Anyone wearing wool?
Except for, merino. I don't even own anything that's made of wool.
No. Yeah, well, my socks are made of bamboo, I think, so. Not enough.
It's popular here, at least in the blankets and...
in Himachal, they manufacture, weave the wool.
Yes.
And produce the clothes, coat,
You also
blanket
have
and shawls.
you also have yak wool, no? use
Yakult और कम एरिया में लाहौर स्पीति में लाहौर स्पीति एरिया में और में लाहौर स्पीति एरिया तिब्बत के साथ जो होता है
Yes, my student from Himachal, when he returned from his big trip with the Goshalas, he brought me a woolen hat, which I was very pleased to receive. Yes, doesn't keep the, obviously you don't have a lot of sun there because it doesn't have a brim, but that's okay. Very kind of him. So yeah, food is very important. And the extremes of the weather, drought preparation, etc. Now we've talked about, I'm not going to talk about this because we've discussed that already, inappetence in sheep, shy feeding, and salmonellosis. Did we talk about salmonellosis? No? Okay. Salmonellosis is a growing problem worldwide. And one of the reasons is because we're feeding antibiotic, or we have fed antibiotics in the feed, and so we've seen resistant organisms develop, and salmonella is one of those. We have E. coli as another, and Staph aureus is another. So, you know, in adding antibiotics to the feed, not so much sheep feed, but I'm just saying generally salmonellosis is a growing problem worldwide because of our use of antibiotics. And in the case of sheep that are highly stressed, they're very prone to salmonella infection. So this is a gastrointestinal infection, of course. You get it in India quite a bit, I think. And the sheep that go on the ship, they are very prone to salmonellosis, and they stop eating. It stops them eating. So quite a problem. And particularly if it's very hot. It's multiple stresses. The immune system goes down. Our gut is really like our second brain. It's very, very clever, our gut. So it has a remarkably good immune system. It can also mop up toxins and things like that. It is one of the cleverest organs in the body. So if we stress the animal, then the gut stops functioning. It gets unhappy, and yeah, the animal gets sick. Sheep, of course, highly social animals, and they are very susceptible to stocking density being too high or too low. In the case of sheep going on for long distance transport, preparation of the animal is the most important thing. Preparing the animal to go on that long journey is really important. So what do we need to do in that preparation? We get the animal used to high stocking densities. So here's a preparation shed in Western Australia before the sheep are going on a ship to go to Yemen in the Middle East. A 10-day voyage, and I've traveled with those sheep. Yeah, it's not fun. It's a difficult voyage for them. So crucially here, the floor is slatted, so the pellets fall through, so they can't pick up salmonella there from the pellets, from the feces. They're getting used to high stocking densities, and they're getting used to being fed pelleted food. These sheep have come off pasture. They're not used to eating little pellets. They're used to eating grasses. They're not used to, 24 hours light in the ship. They're used to, daylight, nighttime. So it's a very strange environment for them. And not only that, but they're being mixed with all sorts of other sheep that they've never seen before. And they're very social animals. They have their strong peck order, their dominance order. And we put them in conditions which can be very stressful. But this is an attempt to make the stress less.
No, but is this how they will be be like this for 10 days?
Yeah.
Yeah, and
That's stocking density, yes.
not stop.
Yeah. The space allowance for sheep on a ship is little more than it physically occupies. It's a tiny bit more than they would get on a truck. So on a truck they're really squashed in. On a ship they have tiny bit more room. Basically for each sheep it's 2/3 of a square meter. 2/3 of a square
So
meter.
they can't sit or...
They can lie down, but what happens is they all tend to have to lie down together. You know, you don't get one animal lying down and the other one standing up. They all lie down together. And they will lie down by the edges of the pen. Each pen has got about 200 sheep in it, or between 100 and 200 sheep in it. And they lie down at the edges because then they won't get other animals closing in on top of them. That's what they're really frightened of. If other animals close in on top of them, they can't get up. And then they're finished. Yeah, so this is attempting to prepare them from that journey.
Does lateral flow cause injuries?
I don't think so. You can have sheep on wooden slats, and then the wood gets broken, and then they can get their claws down between the slats. That's really nasty. If a sheep gets stuck like that, I've seen them like that, it's horrible. They can pull the claw off trying to escape. Horrible. Okay, so the shy feeding, yeah, they just give up feeding, some of them. Not huge numbers, but maybe 1% is the biggest cause of mortality, that they will just give up feeding on the ship. 1%, and then they die. If you pull them out, then they get better, but especially if they get chaff. But the trick is to see them. You have to be able to see them, and so it's harder with sheep than it is with cattle, because with cattle you can see a hollow rumen. With sheep, yeah, the crew need to be looking at the sheep all the time very carefully. So usually the crew is often from Bangladesh actually, or Philippines. They are there in quite large numbers on the ship, and they are looking for sick animals who are not feeding. So the problem of shy feeding, it's very much linked to salmonellosis. It's the two problems together. And when the animal is stressed and sick, it can't resist salmonellosis. Feed distribution is potentially a problem for sheep. You know, I mentioned before how if you feed the sheep just in a line, because sheep can be quite dominant, they may push the ones at the end off the line, and so they don't feed. Similar problem on the ships. Here the feed may not come into the troughs properly, so what this chap is doing, he's going around making sure that the feed troughs are getting filled up properly, because sometimes the pellets they get stuck in the tubes and then they don't fill up the troughs properly. So that's important, making sure they've got food. On the ships, you get accumulation of the feces and urine, and it will normally, because the ventilation rate is very high on the ships, because you've got such a high stocking density, ventilation rate's very high, and so it dries it. But sometimes, if it gets too humid, like in the port of Muscat, for example, then the feces becomes all wet in a slurry, and animals can die in that as well. So what are the best welfare indicators on the ship? Some of the nutrition related ones are the sheep eating properly? There's another one, I think. Have they got their heads out? No. So these are all the welfare problems during the transport. But the biggest indicator of welfare problems is just mortality. So this is a survey that we did of people concerned with the live export industry, and the further these go to the right, the more important they're rated as indicators of welfare on the ship. So the best indicator is whether they've died or not. It's a pretty blunt instrument. It's a pretty blunt measure, but there's not much else. And I think we'll touch on this probably on Saturday, Utero and I, because it begs the question, really, how do you measure welfare when you've got 80,000 animals in one ship? It's very different to measuring welfare of 4 cows in a farm. Totally different, because you can't take many measures. Okay, so I haven't told you a lot about sheep nutrition. A lot of what we said, I guess, with the cow, some of that is relevant. I haven't talked about pregnancy toxemia, but it's the same theory. If you push the animal to want too much from it, the physiology is challenged. So pregnancy toxemia is basically when, this is when the metabolism of the sheep is most likely to collapse. And what happens is in pregnancy, in late pregnancy, if a ewe is carrying twins or triplets, then her energy supply is too low, and she collapses. And so we can overcome that problem by seeing which ewes have twins or triplets and feeding them a bit better compared with the ewes that just have single lambs. So that's one problem. Hypermagnesemia, that grass staggers, just as much of a problem with sheep as it is with cattle. Hypercalcemia as well is a problem. So ruminant animals, quite similar problems. Lameness, a problem, but not as feed related. It's a real problem with sheep, but the biggest problem is sheep on wet pasture. And getting foul in the foot. Sheep did not evolve to, be stomping around on wet ground. Cattle did. Sheep evolved in the mountains. And there are certain breeds of sheep which will cope better with wet conditions, but the pasture becomes loaded up with some of the bacteria that get between the claws of the sheep and cause lameness. An inflammation causing lameness in the sheep. Supplementation of sheep during lactation, again milk fever can be a problem. Supplementing the sheep that are carrying twins or triplets is important, but maybe you don't have prolific breeds like that. Most of your sheep are up in the north, I think, aren't they? Yeah. Yeah, and you have hair sheep and wool sheep. You have the caracal up north, I know.
कौन सी breed sheep की breeds आपको मालूम है?
Merino है.
हाँ, hair sheep merino type है.
Okay.
Wool sheep भेड़ जिसको बोलते हैं, ये herds में रखते हैं वहाँ हिमाचल में और शिफ्ट करते रहते हैं. इंटर एरिया में वो लोअर बेल्ट में आ जाते हैं, वहाँ उनको ग्रीनरी मिलती है और समर एरिया में वो हाइट्स करते हैं.
What's the famous pashmina?
Yes.
Especially
Is that from goats?
They are called gati.
Pashmina's goat hair, isn't it? It's the soft hair in the front of the goat, the belly hair, which is very, very soft.
But we say wool, right?
Yeah, okay, but it comes from a goat, I think.
It's in the goats that is pashmina.
Yes.
Pashmina goats, they say. Yeah. I think it's wool only, but it's called wool, right?
Yes, yeah, it's called wool, but it comes from goats. It's that very, very, very soft hair in the front of a goat.
Called pashmina.
Yes.
And I think
Very expensive.
Pashmina
Yes.
goats only. Pashmina goats are just bred in Kashmir by nomads. So last year there was a cloudburst.
We-
A lot of these goats were affected.
Here we go. I'm sure Mr. Google will help us out. Cashmere wool. Name comes from the Persian.
Goat, yeah.
Yeah. Yes, it's that soft, very soft hair. It's one of the softest fibers around.
Himachal, Pakistan and Nepal.
And Himachal Pradesh as well, in northern
Too
India.
warm. Too warm.
Very warm.
In Himachal? Like the Pashmina yarn.
Yes.
Yeah.
Yes. Well,
It needs to protect their own body and we take it off.
Lightweighted and too warm.
okay. When my student came back from Himachal, Arvind, I got the hat, but my wife got the pashmina. She did very well. Yes. Good. Well, tomorrow we will do a little calculation exercise of rationing. Would that be interesting? Yeah. How much do you feed cows? How much energy? How much minerals and things? And we'll talk about measuring welfare as well. Oh no, we're going to do that on the last day.
Whenever we have time.
Yeah, because we may be going to a farm tomorrow. I'm not sure. I don't know. Dr. Prasenjit has talked about it twice, 2 or 3 times, but I'm not sure anything has happened. So. Yes, we'll definitely do nutrition rationing, some rationing. Visit to local farm. I don't know where it is, but we thought it'd be nice to go and see some cows in a village setting. I'll email him and say that you'd like to do that.
I would like to visit to model farm.
Model farm. Okay. Yes. Well, I'll pass that message on. He's the boss.
Is it like a good model?
Good model. Last time हमें वो लेके थे
India?
नहीं लेडी चलाती है कमर्शियल सैनिक कॉलोनी में या सैनिक
Acha, ma, Anuradha Modi ji.
हाँ
But it's a goshala, it's not a farm.
हाँ गौशाला
It's a goshala.
अच्छा वो फार्म में लगे तो वो फरीदाबाद में लगे ये
Cow में.
भैंसों के उसमें तो बड़ा
There are a lot of welfare problems.
हाँ वेलफेयर प्रोग्राम की स्टडी के लिए लगे कोई एक भी उसमें
But
इस पर नहीं
the housing practice in that goshala and Sainik farm is much better than like animals are in, cows are in paddocks rather than, they're not tied 24 hours.
या
There is a natural shade with trees.
नहीं वो तो है प्रोडक्ट्स वाला जो थी वो कोई खास प्रोडक्ट्स नहीं है वो कमर्शियल प्रोडक्ट्स
सिखाते हैं.
दिखाते हैं ट्रेनिंग देते हैं कोई ऐसी प्रोग्राम होनी चाहिए ट्रेनिंग ताकि वो
मैं बता दूंगी आपको. वहाँ पे वो बता देंगी जो करवा सकते हैं.
Good. Well, thank you for coming today. It was probably the heaviest day today, was a lot of the theory about feeding cows and how cows work. So today was the heaviest day. Tomorrow, the rationing, will be a bit more mathematically challenging, maybe. If anyone has a calculator, perhaps you could bring it with you. Maybe if you have one on your phone.
Everyone would have one. Calculator. Phone.
Okay. And then the last day, we'll have a look at measuring welfare and a discussion about feeding the world. Bringing it all together, a lot of the things we've been talking about. Yeah. Good. Thank you. We'll see you tomorrow.